In this podcast called Absolute Value Equations and Inequalities, we'll be adding inequalities, solving inequalities with absolute values to our study of the absolute value. Getting right into it, our box says here to solve absolute value equations and inequalities, there are two steps to go through. First, isolate the absolute value. That means get it by itself on one side. And second, use the appropriate rule to remove the absolute value bar. Now, we've had this problem of getting x out of the grouping symbol anytime we've tried to solve for x. If you have a simple equation like this where the grouping symbol is a parentheses, the way you remove the parentheses is you distribute. And once you distribute, you've got x out of the parentheses, so you can now go ahead and solve for x. When we had radical equations, the way that we would get x out of the grouping symbol, because a radical is a grouping symbol, see, it's grouping together the x and the 1. The way we'd get the x out of that grouping symbols was we'd square both sides. And when we squared the left side, we'd get 4 times x minus 1, and when we squared the right side, we'd get 9. And now x is out of the grouping symbol, and we can go ahead and solve for x. And the question is, well, how do you get x out of a grouping symbol if the grouping symbol is the absolute value? Well, these three rules tell you how to do it. Let's go through them. Rule number 1, it says if you've got an absolute value equation, that is the absolute value of some mess is equal to a number k, then the way you get rid of the absolute value is you write either the mess is equal to k or the mess is equal to negative k. Notice in this second line here, the absolute value is now gone. So if the mess contains x, I can now solve for x. Rule 2 tells you what to do if it's an absolute value inequality and the inequality is the less than. It says if you've got the absolute value of some mess is less than k, then you write negative k is less than the mess is less than k. And notice again, in the second line, you've gotten rid of the absolute value. And that's what you're trying to do. You're figuring out, how do I get rid of this absolute value? And these rules are telling you how to do it. The last thing that can happen is you can have an absolute value inequality with the absolute value of some mess greater than k. Then how do you get rid of the absolute value? Well, you write m is greater than k. That is, you just drop off the absolute value, or m is less than negative k. That's not a real good negative sign there, but that is a negative sign on the k. And again, if you look at line 2, the absolute value bar is gone now. So these three rules tell you how to get rid of absolute value bars. Now, I do need to make a comment. Absolute values are never negative. Absolute value means positive value. So an absolute value is never negative. So the note under Rule 1 says, if k is negative, stop. This is not going to have a solution. If you have a problem like the absolute value of x is less than -3, just stop and say no solution, because an absolute value can't be negative. Number 2 again says if k is less than 0, there's no solution. Number 3 says if k is less than 0, all numbers are solution. Suppose I had absolute value of 2x is greater than -4. Well, that would have to be true, since an absolute value is either 0 or positive. 0 and positive numbers are always bigger than 4. Doesn't make any difference what x is. It's always going to be a solution. Okay, well, with that in mind, let's go on and let's try example 1. Example 1 says solve. Well, it should say solve, so I'll write it in here. Solve. The absolute value of 2x plus 1 is greater than k. Now, I go to my three rules to see which rule applies. Well, in Rule 1, I've got the absolute value equal to something. In Rule 2, absolute value is less than something. So this is a Rule 3 problem. Now notice, it's nothing about the absolute value plus 1 being greater than k, and what I've got here is the absolute value plus 1. And the first step, it says up here, when you're trying to solve an absolute value inequality, isolate the absolute value, get it by itself. So the very first thing I'm going to do is get rid of that 1 so that it's going to look exactly like rule 3. And I get the absolute value of 2x minus 1 is greater than 6, and that 2x minus 1, that's my mess m. So I've got the absolute value of m is greater than k. Rule 3 says write the following. The mess is greater than k, or the mess is less than negative k. Now we're going to solve that out. I add 1 to both sides, and I get 2x is greater than 7, so x is greater than 7/2, which is 3.5. Then it says or, and I add 1 to both sides, 2x is less than -5, x is less than -5/2. -5/2 is the same as -2.5. So my solutions are any numbers which are either less than -2.5 or greater than 3.5. So I'm going to put that on a graph so you can see what that looks like. First I'll have to locate -2.5. There's -1, -2, -3. So -2.5 would be right in the middle there, so I'll mark it. And I'm going to write 2.5 by it, so anybody looking at my work will know that I meant for that mark to be -2.5. And then I need to write positive 3.5, so here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I go right here to between 3 and 4, there's 3.5. Again, I write that above it, so anybody looking at my work knows that I'm trying to write 3.5 there. Now, my solutions are any numbers that are either bigger than 3.5, well that would be these numbers, and I'm using a round bracket because it's bigger, it's not bigger than or equal to. Or they're smaller than -2.5, so that would be numbers this way. So that would be my graphical answer. So that makes it pretty easy to do an interval answer. The numbers here start out at -infinity. So I do -infinity. Infinities always get a round bracket, comma. It can't equal to -2.5, but it comes right up to it. So I use a round bracket. Now remember, this symbol stood for the word and this symbol called union stands for the word or. So I'm going to say union, open at 3, all the way to positive infinity. And there's an example of how you would use the 3 rules to remove your absolute value sign and get a solution. So the inequality form includes the word or. That's part of the inequality form of the answer. The graphical form of my answer and the interval form of my answer. The 3 forms. Always when you're practicing, put your answer in all 3 forms. That concludes the podcast.